Hi there, and welcome back to the Teen History Podcast. I'm your host, Alexander Mallet, and today we'll be talking about the event that inspired revolutions all across the globe and led to multiple global tensions like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, we'll be talking about the Cuban Revolution. As always, we have a special guest with us here today to help us try and understand what this major historical event even was. Please welcome Columbia history professor Eamon Savoy-Dykmans.
Thanks for having me on today. I've read all about your podcast over the internet.
Oh wow, that's great. I hope you like all the reviews you read. Anyway, should we start off with some basic history of Cuba?
Sounds like a great idea.
Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know, Cuba is a small island nation in the northern Caribbean that's been through decades of occupation and control by foreign governments and dictatorships.
Exactly. In fact, Cuba was first found when Christopher Columbus arrived there in 1492, after the Spanish invasions of other islands in the Caribbean. As soon as the Spaniards arrived, the local Guanahatevi, Chiavoni, and Taino groups were eliminated by the explorers or died from diseases that they had carried with them from Europe.
So that was the reason why Spanish culture, language, and government was able to be enforced on the islands when the Spanish formally colonized the islands in the 16th and 17th centuries?
Exactly. This only represented the start of Cuba's problems, which eventually led to the Cuban Revolution.
But how? These events were hundreds of years apart. Surely they can't be that connected.
Well, as slavery was gradually stopped across the United States and the Caribbean, Haiti's sugar economy started to collapse due to the lack of labor available. This shifted sugar production towards Cuba. Sugar plantations started to replace the cattle and tobacco plantations on the island, and slaves started to arrive on the island in large numbers from old colonial areas. This caused the Spanish government to start paying more attention to the island and start to rule it more officially. This made Cuba one of the last Spanish colonies in South America and the Caribbean as Spain began to withdraw from the Americans.
And that meant that the Spanish governance of the island increased the taxes, and the despotism also increased, which caused problems for the Creole inhabitants and triggered a war between Cuba and Spain from 1868 to 1878 for Cuba's independence.
Yes, exactly. So due to rising tensions with Spain, the USA joined the war and effectively took over Cuba and was given ownership of the island after the Treaty of Paris in 1898.
That makes sense. But my question is still how was that related to the revolution, which took place over half a century later and against a non-US government?
Well, because of the U.S. government, the island fell into a state of constant corruption that was everywhere in the government and politics and throughout the 20th century. Corruption was extremely common in the Cuban society also, with prostitution rings popping up all over the place.
But what about after Cuba regained independence from the U.S.? Did the corruption stop there?
Well, corruption actually increased significantly in Cuba after its independence from the U.S. in 1902. The Cuban president of Jose Miguel Gomez of 1909 increased this corruption even more with bribes and payments to legislators and officials. Corruption would then remain in Cuba mostly hidden, with politicians being elected to office on promises of stopping corruption, but having corruption increase under their rule.
But then this corruption was noticed by the public and an ex-soldier who hated the corruption named Fulgencio Batista, who was elected to office from 1940 to 1944, and then served as president in 1952 again after a peaceful military coup.
Exactly, and this area, often called the Batista regime, was what led the Cuban Revolution.
Okay, that makes perfect sense now. But what was it about the new regime that really angered Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries so much?
I mean, under Batista's regime, Cuba experienced numerous negative effects on its economy and people. Under his rule, the underemployment and unemployment rate rose between 15 to 20%. In the labor forces, and farmers and agricultural workers were only able to find 123 about 4 months of the year, leaving them unemployed and impoverished for most of the year.
I was also reading how Batista had promised to end corruption in the country, but in fact, many officials and politicians accepted bribes from criminal organizations such as the American Mafia, which was widely spread in Havana. Bribes also increased prostitution, gambling, and drug deals within the country.
And that was so extreme that cocaine at times was seen as accessible as standard rum. This contributed to increased violent and sexual crime rates in Cuba. And to add on, Batista also allowed American companies to move into the nation and dominate its economy.
And for the listeners out there, here's some statistics on that. So private companies were estimated to own about 90% of Cuban mines, 80% of public utilities, and 40% of its sugar production.
Exactly. The new regime, caused economic issues for all Cubans and enraged them. And just to make it worse, Batista ran a police state that murdered over 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, who were claimed to be rebels against the new system.
That's horrible. Surely the whole nation must have been furious at the government at this point.
That's exactly what happened, and that really marked the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, which was an armed and violent revolution led by Fidel Castro that overthrew Batista's era of dictatorship. It started on the 29th of July in 1953 and ended on the 1st of January in 1959.
And for some context, Fidel Castro, who was a young Cuban lawyer and activist, had been running for Congress just before Batista's coup, but was stopped by Batista's regime. In opposition to this new regime, Castro decided to lead a raid against an army barrack located in Santiago de Cuba City, which marked the start of the revolution.
Pretty much. But the raid actually failed, and Castro and his brother were captured and thrown in prison. Thankfully, they were eventually released after the international pressure on Batista to release them. The brothers then escaped to Mexico, where they would gather 82 men together to form the group that would eventually overthrow the dictatorship.
But the brothers returned, didn't they?
Oh, yes. The men had planned an attack over the course of many years, and in November 1956, these 82 men sailed from Mexico to Cuba with the intent to overthrow Batista's regime. However, Batista had expected this attack, and the 82 men were ambushed on the 2nd of December in 1956. Only 20 managed to escape, including Castro, and fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains.
And from there, the rebel group would regroup and grow its forces over 2 years of constant guerrilla warfare against the government forces, causing a civil war.
And that marked the time when the Cuban government started to suspend all civil rights of the Cuban people, which included freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And the presidential election was indefinitely postponed due to violence, which only built support for Castro's coup.
But how did this conflict ever end? Weren't the Cuban military forces much more powerful than Castro's forces? How could they ever win against an entire army?
Well, on the 1st of January, Batista fled the country for the Dominican Republic, and then later Portugal. This was due to how Castro's forces had recently won the Battle of Santa Clara and captured a train full of arms and ammunition from the Cuban, or that was meant for the Cuban military, which severely weakened them.
And then Castro claims power on the 9th of January 1959 and created a new provisional government?
Yep, and that marked the official end of the Cuban Revolution.
But surely the Cuban Revolution didn't just end. What was the aftermath of it?
Not at all. In fact, Cuba tried to inspire other nations to revolt against their leaders. It tried to do this by arming rebel groups in Ghana, Nicaragua, Algeria, and Angola, where 60,000 Cuban soldiers helped fight in the Civil War.
And to add on, the American government recognized Castro's new government originally, but then quickly cut ties with them after Castro started a government which was founded heavily on communist ideals and made allies with the Soviet Union. And this would lead to rising tensions like the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Exactly. Castro was heavily criticized and still is today by many experts because Castro had originally announced that democratic elections would be held after the revolution, but they were never actually organized. And under his rule, Cuba's trade economy declined, so hundreds of thousands of Cubans emigrated in search of other jobs.
Wow, that was an amazing recap of the history of this major historical event. But what are your opinions on this entire conflict?
I mean, the revolution was a major turning point in Cuba's history, since it represented the first time in history since colonization that it was under a just and fair government rule and was not oppressed by dictators or other countries with foreign interests. To add on, it led other major events in global history that helped to shape the world we live in today and showed that dictatorships can always be overthrown no matter how powerful.
That's a great opinion. It's been a pleasure talking with you about this, and I hope that all of our listeners loved hearing your info as well.
It was great to be hosted here. I'd love to come back again. Thank you